There we
Great.
go. Yeah, so I might find some stuff to share along the way, but I'll just talk. And if anyone wants to interrupt or wants to ask anything at any point, that's totally cool. Um, so I'm old now, so I've had quite a windy journey to get to where I am. I originally, when I was at high school, I was doing audio and video production, and I wanted to be like into cinematography or record bands in a recording studio or something like that. And so I didn't really know what to do with any of that. So I ended up going to university and kind of got missold onto a course that was computer science. So I was completely out of my depth. And so I quit. I then worked in a warehouse for a while and did loads of other jobs to try and work out what to do with my life. And then started to teach myself web design. And then years later realized actually I could do this and I was in the right place. So then went to university as a more mature student, like 25, which over here is a little more unusual. So in that time, it was really interesting kind of being the wilderness years of having no clue what to do. And at the time, I felt like you needed a degree to be able to make a website. And, and very quickly, in retrospect, that was incredibly naive. But then from that, I got through so many different kinds of roles, from small agencies, large agencies, working at the BBC, working for Auto Trader was my last role, which was a fairly decent size organization, and now up to zeroheight. So it's been a kind of a windy path, which I always find useful when I speak to other people. Like, very few people go in a straight line. And so what you start doing now is trying to find that adaptability in your story and how you transfer those skills that you acquire. And actually, even thinking back to the days working in a warehouse or something has been really useful, thinking like, so even some of that is applicable now. It's really weird. So originally, I wanted to be more visual. I wanted to be a designer, but then I saw what people were doing and felt that was just, I clearly wasn't talented enough. So I tried to learn code as a way of expressing myself. So I didn't set out trying to be a developer or trying to be an engineer, especially as that was such a long time ago. There weren't so many established roles. So it was kind of like, if I learn some code, I might be able to express what's in my head, and that feels interesting. And it was still quite unknown. So you're kind of prodding around, you made a forum or all this kind of stuff, just seeing how to make it work. But so I always felt like I was in between design and development, which over the years has been interesting. Sometimes people want to pigeonhole you and say, you are a designer, you are an engineer. But the truth is always the middle bit is so much more interesting. And that's why eventually, as design systems have become a thing, it felt like a perfect fit. So in a way, I'll get to some of what design systems are just to clarify in a minute, but through agency or making a product of some kind, you've got a very conventional workflow of there's a problem space, and at some point there will be a solution delivered. And so very often people will say they work in an agile way and try and get stuff out, but actually it still goes through the same process, just faster. So you have very often a product owner or product manager often working with a designer quite early days to try and work out what is the problem, what might our solution look like, then engage a wider team to work out, we think it might be like this, how do we validate it, and then get something in front of users to test and then to release. And that's kind of fun, but it becomes quite predictable life cycle of the problem space, blah, 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 live code. So design systems are a real challenge to the way that lots of people work. So if you think like the one design system make you feel like it's a design only tool, and fundamentally it isn't. It brings together everyone to create better products. So very often if you read blogs about design systems, they'll be talking about the structure in Figma or whatever design tool you use. And it's very much more about trying to pull out the design patterns from your designs to make them more generic. So instead of having buttons all over your design files, you'll have one button, and it might have a number of properties. So whether it has an icon in it or not, whether it's just the primary color, like your main action color, or do you have a secondary version as well? So you get to be a little bit more introspective and think about, it's like a product within a product. You're making a system that powers everything else, that enables all the product teams in a large organization to make the user-facing stuff. So if you think about almost any screenshot of any website, you get to spot recurring patterns, like not just a button, which is a noddy example, but any kind of small bits of layout which serve a purpose, like a news headline, a news summary, or something like that. So some of the art of design systems is being able to break things down into smaller, tangible bits and understand their purpose and what problem they're solving. That's really quite a lot of a tangent. So I think what I found was, going back to my last role, I went to Auto Trader as front-end lead. So I was responsible for the front-end developers. And a lot of what that really involved was working closely with design. So at the point that I started, the situation wasn't unusual to find, where there's lots of different code bases all over the place. Communication within design wasn't great. And kind of designers would blame front-enders for the end product not being correct. Front-enders would be kind of annoyed with designers for not providing consistent designs or changing stuff on the fly. So it was a real people problem. The fun thing for me was kind of being new and just getting to know everyone and saying, oh, okay, so tell me about what you do. What's interesting? What's happening for you? And almost seeing that opportunity to be in the middle of, there's lots of stuff going on. Lots of people are annoyed at each other. How do we simplify this? And a lot of the time, that's what you see through design systems when you get more into it. It's almost always a people problem. So going back to that original scenario, it's a case of, okay, we can't fix everything. What we can do is within design, we can try and say, at the moment, what was happening, a designer would just pick any level of font size. Let's look at that. Can we rationalize that a little bit? Cool. So now we've communicated, we've made some decisions. How might we execute that in code? And so we started to think about, how do we share and get consistency? That was an ongoing thing as well, because you can't just click your fingers and it's a magic solution. The overall company size is about 1,000 people. In products and technology, there was about 300, all different kinds of roles. And so no one was going to give us the time and say, right, can you just make everything better? So you had to be quite careful about, okay, we need to fix things. We need to try and get better alignment. So how do we craft out that little bit of time? How do we try and make some decisions together which make things better? And actually that decision making is the biggest thing I found early on, where it's not as a senior person coming in and saying, right, this is what we're doing. It's how do you get a collective together and form a consensus about a design choice? That was really interesting. And I think it's something that's very often missed out. It's like, that's a real art, because almost like you check your ego at the door, and it's not about what you like or your choices. It's about trying to say, I feel like this represents the brand properly. This kind of hierarchy we've got exists for a reason. If we disagree with that, that's brilliant. Challenge it, but in a constructive way. Because once you do that with one thing, there's like this mechanism that evolves about how you discuss things and how you make decisions as a group. So we went through all sorts of things like auditing what was currently live on the site, looking at typography, looking at color, some of the basic stuff. And we kind of questioned it, tried to find like the correct version of things. And then looking through the code base too, and saying, well, for some reason, over these 5 different code bases, there's duplicates of all these buttons, which should be the same. And that's not uncommon. You see that all over the place. You'll have some legacy code that people haven't touched in years, alongside the latest and greatest, all trying to look the same or do the same job, but they're not. And I think there's countless times I've had conversations with people where they're like, we did an audit of what's live on our site and we found 27 versions of the same primary call to action. Mm-hmm. And that's no one person's fault. You have to assume everyone's going into it from good intent, wanting to do good work. And somehow things have just been miscommunicated a little bit, or designs evolved. and this code is out of date. These things happen. And so it's never a blame game. It's then, okay, we've made some choices. How can we best execute? Without going into too much technical detail, we had like Java over here, we had React, some old JavaScript, all sorts of stuff happening. So there wasn't one technical solution either. Mm-hmm. So we said, okay, what can we share? We can share CSS. So we found a way, a very simple way, again, not hugely engineered, to say, okay, if we look at buttons or colors or typography, that's something we can provide which will work for everyone. So let's start with that idea of sharing. So then all the development teams around should be able to pull down the CSS file, and there you go. You are now using kind of one button. Under the hood, it opened the door then to say, okay, we can share stuff now. We've cracked that bigger question of how do we do this? So all of this stuff wasn't about the artifacts. It wasn't about the design files. It wasn't about the code. It's all a people problem. Mm-hmm. And so what I found was, starting at zeroheight, and I talked to a lot of customers, it's almost always the case. It's the people bit that gets.
Yeah, I was talking a little last week or a couple of weeks ago about if you don't identify things in your design, especially if you're working with a totally separate team, if you're at an agency and the developers are at a company, they're going to make their own decisions. And if there's multiple developers and one designer, you're going to have multiple decisions being made about your designs. So yeah. And then from the other side, it's from the, as a developer, getting designs that aren't really clearly identified is really frustrating. Or like you'll get a design where, if it's not using Figma with styles, which is Figma has changed things so dramatically, but you'll get a design where every single page has like a different style for the H1, and you're like, okay, what is the H1? Like just the simplest things become complicated without a contract, and that's kind of what a design style is a contract.
Exactly that. And a lot of it is like, instead of saying, oh, it looks like this, it's like, what's its purpose? And it flips it around a little bit and going, you're not creating art, it's design. And so you need some constraints. And if you don't have any, you need to establish them for yourself. So you don't just have these headings or something like that. There is a hierarchy which exists for a reason. And so it's trying to, as a collective, say, do we all understand what this is? Now can we communicate it to developers or other people so that it's clear that they don't just exist, they have a purpose, like you would use this to do what? And so I think that's something different that I think we were kind of missing with the normal product workflow. But as design systems, it's going back to that thing of, well, why does this thing exist? Because we don't want to throw the kitchen sink into a system full of all these little components and bits and pieces. They need to solve problems. Mm-hmm. So I think it is that interrogation of, we've got this hierarchy of typography. As a designer, how do you use it appropriately? Mm-hmm. So I think with design systems as well, you'll see everything from people talking about it being a well-structured Figma file, so lots of layers of components and complexity. You could have a documentation suite somewhere, like zeroheight or anything really to describe what's in that file to a broader audience than just designers. You can go so far as incorporating code and have examples of their actual rendered components, all the way through to releasing live code. So the design system could be as small or as big as you want to make it. But the whole point is just to agree on things and find a method of sharing. And that's really massive.
Mm-hmm. Any thoughts? Can you guys hear okay in the back? Yeah, okay. Yeah, any thoughts come to mind with like, thinking about what you're doing and then sharing it? Like something that I think about is we have one design project where every page has a slight modification, like a background image or color is different, or, the button colors are different. And so how would that play out in a design system? Would it be like a page flavor, or I don't know, how would you wind up using that?
So very often it looks like you have a component that solves a problem. So maybe you've got a hero image or something like that, like some kind of a hero space.
Mhm.
So the first thing is you make it generic. What's the purpose of that? What is it trying to do? So very often it's like draw your attention with a graphic and give you some intro text or something like that. You say, okay, cool. So we're clear that this is to tell a user very clearly where they are and what to expect from the rest of the content. Cool. So now what are its use cases? And then you can start to think about different variants. So does it always link somewhere? Does it always have the same image, or should that be something that can be supplied by an author, a consumer of the design system? If that's the case, then how do you describe what is good or bad use of that? Because you're going to get emergent use cases all the time. Every time someone uses a component, you'll find a new take on it, a new challenge. And that's what you want. Ideally, people out there using your design system should try and break it. And you should welcome that challenge. If they go, oh, I found a new way of doing it. I'm sorry, I've messed it up. Like as a team working on a design system, that's brilliant.
Yeah, do all the outliers become part of the design system then? Because I always imagine like this, I've been a developer forever, and so the outliers they just become the spaghetti, that's just like, so I guess they get rolled in, but they're just like a modification of something. Maybe they're just like a branch of a tree or something.
Yeah, exactly like that. And so you've got choices to make. And what you don't want is to try and get everything possible into a design system, because it becomes too big and too unwieldy.
Yeah.
And so if, for example, if you're a kind of site where you've got lots of forms aren't exciting to design or to code, but somehow you need to be able to guide a user through this stuff, which is probably really boring, not the highlight of their day. And so instead of thinking about how do I design or code up each of these form fields and buttons, what it does is give you that confidence of, I don't need to do that. I pull them from the library, from the design system. I can now focus more on the problem space than the execution. So you're thinking more about, am I solving the problem in the best way? Not how do I do this, or I need to factor in a day to do all these designs. So what I noticed through the work at AutoTrader was, especially around forms or even just landing pages, is getting people closer to that problem space, because you worry less about how you're going to execute. So for one example of that, we started a proper design system, and it was on the back of a bit of a rebrand. So this was all stuff that was only going to exist in the new system with a new look and feel. And so we had a bit of slack there. And when COVID happened and we had lockdowns in the UK, we had a meeting on Monday morning. Okay, apparently we're going to have lockdowns. We need to understand what this means for car dealers and everyone, and we need to get our response out. So, there's lots of heads of department there going, okay, so what should we say? What should we do? And very often, for some reason, they had this idea that it would take a week to get a landing page out, which sounds ridiculous, but with internal machinations and people signing off on things, it can happen. So it's like, okay, don't worry about execution. Me and my team will take care of that. So let's get back to what do you want to say? And after a while, they felt quite comfortable with the messaging. And so I worked with the senior content designer, and he and I just went backwards and forwards a little bit. Let's be really clear on what we're trying to say and what should the user take away. We looked at the components that we had in the design system. And again, there's solutions to problems. So I looked at the messaging and like, oh, okay, so you want to say something like that. I think the hero component will work for that one. I think that one works really nicely there. So actually, it was more about the composition overall with the content. So instead of thinking, oh, we've got a week to somehow do this thing, within about an hour and a half, we had a prototype that people could click on and play with internally. they were able to critique it and go, I'm not sure that's quite right, maybe a different image here, and it was live by the end of the day. And that was not possible before for loads of reasons. So because we had these components, and because we focused more on the problem space and what we were trying to say, the execution was easy.
Yeah. Do people add high fidelity wireframes to design systems? Is that part of the system, or is that generally like it's because I could see that like you're basically using the components, you're just using simplified versions of them. So I could see that happening.
Yeah, you could do. I think what I've often seen is either people do less design work, or you could even sketch it on a piece of paper, because if you understand the components in the system and the constraints upon them, go, oh, I think we need one of those, one of those, one of those. And so the relationship between design and developer changes. So one of the things is, if you went a bit more old school, a designer might feel that we were Photoshop and had to spend ages getting everything pixel perfect. What design system means is that that's irrelevant. We've got a whole set of things, like from spacing units, typography, color, up to quite complex components already made.
Mm-hmm.
So your job isn't pixel precision, it's about the solution to the problem. And so it's that design thinking less than pixel pushing. So when you think more about, okay, well, back to the problem, we need to help the user to do this thing. Is that the right way of doing it? Well, if we get these things from the design system, they can put in their information, they can submit the form, blah, 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 blah. How do we validate that? Is that working for us? So it's less about pushing around pixels in a design tool. You've done that, you've got the craft on it, you've made the best button ever. You don't need to draw another button.
All the buttons.
Oh, everyone was
Shiny,
talking about buttons.
shiny red buttons.
Oh yeah, the shinier the better. So I think, again, when you talk about design systems, very often talking about components or these artifacts that exist within it, there are opportunities in themselves. What often causes a lot of friction is that design developer handover, where again, as a designer, you've solved a problem, you've made your layout, you've done the full composition, and you're quite confident in your work, and you pass it to someone else to create it. If you've got parity between codes, so that primary call to action button in Figma is encoded and there is only one in React or Angular, whatever JavaScript frameworks, for example, that should be the same thing. So we're not talking about someone coding up a button 100 different ways or duplication. You've got componentization available in design and in code. So they're called the same thing, they do the same job. And the more you have parity, the more shorthand you can have in that communication process. Instead of going, here's a complete layout, go and make it. It's a case of, okay, we want a primary call to action here. We want to have some form inputs here. You can almost describe it rather than having to spend ages being meticulous.
Yeah. Yeah, because all the layout, like, your padding and margin, it's already decided by the design system. So it's really, it's componentizing design, just like you're componentizing the code.
Completely.
Yeah.
It's that thing as well. Sorry, there's a bit enough of a delay where I feel like I'm talking over you.
Oh, that's okay. It's a short one. I was gonna say, oh, what's too, like, how large of a project do you need to have for a design system to make sense? Like, what's too small?
That's a really good question. I think,
Is
again, it's
anything too
about,
small?
no, I don't think so. I think after working that way for a while, I would probably do that first. Like, you can have a play around and get a look and feel on a design, but quite quickly you go, oh yeah, I could break it down like this, and then immediately you can reuse it.
Yeah,
And so
I
again,
guess
like,
if you can make a component in Figma, then that means you should make a design system.
Potentially, yeah. I mean, you can start super easy, and again, as projects evolve, you might not necessarily know how it's going to go or how big it will get. But if you get quite rehearsed at this stuff, you go, okay, as it seems today, this is our typography, here's our color, we're going to need this, and this. Basically a design system. And then if you get more to add, you've probably got the interpersonal stuff worked out, like, well, how do we make decisions? What should go in there? And now how do we release it so everyone gets to use it?
Okay. Somebody else talk. Come on, Justin, I know you have a question.
I mean, this is kind of a generic question to ask somebody who's been in the industry, but what is your advice for somebody who's about to graduate and is trying to get a job in UX design in this weird tech layoff world we're in?
Oh man, I wish I had a simple answer to that. I think there's a few things, right? It's not always about visuals, it's about how you got there. And so that whole idea of the problem space is really, really interesting. So you can have the best looking design portfolio, but certainly when we used to hire designers, going back to my Auto Trader experience, there'd be a task to do on the day, and you've got all the usual kind of questions talking about your experience. And what's always interesting is how people do things, your problem solvers. That's the really interesting bit in the interview process, is seeing how someone thinks and going, all right, here's a task, you've got an hour, talk us through your process. And so, you should be able to look at almost every problem and go, okay, well, first of all, I don't know enough about this, so how do I find out more? And you can walk people through that way of thinking, because, if it's software or attention to detail or something, you can teach someone that. You can spend a bit of time with someone to refine their existing skills, but it's that thought process. If they say, all right, here's a challenge, and you go, I don't know what to do with this, that's not going to help them. So, certainly it's that you're trying to look for that raw material of this is someone who gets it. This is someone who can solve problems. If it's about execution or software or way of working, you can support someone with that when they onboard.
Yeah.
I also think there's something about adaptability. And so, if there's a challenge or something you're unfamiliar with, it's going, just a problem, it's fine. If they use Sketch instead of Figma, you go, well, okay, I haven't used Sketch before, but still just a design tool.
Yeah.
I'll figure it out.
Yeah.
Thank you.
This is completely self-motivated, this question, but
Excellent. Please, you're honest.
I'd love for you to talk a bit about how your experience with code helped with design, and how, designers that you've worked with that have some coding experience, like how does that help them?
That's huge. It's really huge. By that, I don't mean that every designer should know how to completely write production ready code and release it. It's more being able to find that common ground, because otherwise you're talking at completely different domains, and there's trying to find that bridge in your conversation to make it make sense to each other. So one example would be, you understand the material of the web. So not necessarily how to code HTML and CSS, but you get the constraints that it gives you. Like, the web is inherently fluid. If you resize your browser, at any point there could be a device, and text will reflow, and there's certain properties that make a website. So even if you can get to that point of going, oh, okay, so I know what HTML, CSS, and JavaScript are. I know why you would use one over another, what their jobs are. When you talk to an engineer, which might be coming from a completely different perspective, and if you're talking about, say, typography, they might go, look, I just need to know what values I need. Like, they won't have the same point of view, because they need to execute something. And they'll just want to cut to the chase and go, look, I don't really care what typeface you've chosen. Don't care. What is it? What do I set this as?
Yeah.
And so anything you can do to just see each other's worlds has got to help.
Cool. Excellent answer. Yeah, I wish you could tell all the students who are too afraid to take the class because they don't want to code stuff. Because I feel like it's so helpful to at least have
It's that
the
empathy though, isn't it?
yeah.
Like I've worked with
And go ahead.
I was going to say that we've had we had a platform engineering team at Auto Trader. So these people are so much more geeky than I could ever be, but they were so lovely, and they could make magic happen that I could never. And so again, it's that same thing where while I've been trying to bridge front end and design, here was another set of relationships of going, I genuinely don't know what you do. You kind of, I assume you go out back and hit servers with hammers and somehow just things happen. Well done. So talking to them about deployment processes or continuous integration pipelines and stuff, I was like, I think I understand what you're saying. Can we just say it's magic?
Yeah, there's lots of magic.
Yeah, exactly. And it's trying to find that common ground really, really quickly and stay humble. So it's like, there's not a hierarchy here. It's not like because you were earlier in the process, like say a product owner or something, that somehow there is authority there. It's like, it's flat. We are all in it together to try and make something good for people.
Yeah, that's so true. Yeah, that's something that I've definitely talked about in this class, is that you may run up against developers who have there's amazing developers who understand that everybody has a different skill set, and occasionally you run into developers that think that they're smarter than you because they can code and that design is just pictures, and we all know that that's not true. There's a lot more involved in it, but yeah, and kind of telling them, watch out for those people and don't let them intimidate you, because everybody has an important job and a skill set. Yeah.
And it's like you could be the smartest developer in the world and be able to do incredible things, but it would look horrendous.
Yes.
And no one would actually be able to use the thing.
Yes, exactly. Yes. Usability.
Like the old internet.
Yeah.
Yeah, like the old internet that was, not
completely
by designers.
But I think that's what people forget, is the technology is a people career. It's not a computer thing. It's like the computer is the bit in the middle between you trying to articulate these problems and the other people out there using it. The tech and stuff is just the go-between. It's a middleman.
Yep, it's the plumbing.
Yeah.
I call it developers are like plumbers.
Exactly. They all have mustaches and hats and jump.
Exactly. And butt crack.
Yeah. Mandatory butt crack.
Anyone else have questions?
Please have questions, otherwise I'm going to talk forever.
Yeah. Well, I might make maybe I'll do a demo for them since they're all freaking out about graduating. But yeah, I played a little bit with zeroheight today, and it looks very cool. I haven't contracted it's been a couple years, and things change so rapidly that design systems were sort of newish, and now documentation systems for design systems are definitely new for me. So I'm excited to check out zeroheight some more. You're not going to be in San Francisco, are you, for the Smashing Conf?
I was hoping to, but
I know, what a great excuse to go to San Francisco.
But we're running our own conference in San Francisco soon.
Oh, really? When's that?
Yeah. Well, we've not announced any details, so this is super hush hush. But I think it's going to be 18th of May.
Oh, okay.
And I think the venue's in Chinatown somewhere. So as soon as I've got the information together, I'll pass it on. But yeah, we'll all be over for that.
Very cool. We're in Portland, Oregon, which is it's an 11-hour drive because the US is massive. But I always like an excuse to go down there. So maybe I'll go a week early or something. We'll see.
Yeah, do it.
Right.
Everyone come down. That would be amazing.
Yeah, everyone come to San Francisco. I think there's a train. There's a train, isn't there?
Yeah.
Probably takes it takes like 2.5 days.
Wow.
Like most things about US transportation, it could be much better.
Yeah. Yeah, we'll get a bullet train in like 200 years.
This is look.
All right. Thank you so much for stopping by. And yeah, I don't know. I know where to find you. I'll pop into the Smashing Slack later on after class and say hello and thanks and all that. Yeah, any questions you have for us? Do you want to know anything about us?
Like, I guess, like, are you enjoying it? Like, what sort of thing do you want to do after you graduate?
They're all in deer and headlights mode right now.
I'm enjoying it.
Yeah, Justin's enjoying it. He's
Hey,
the
that's cool.
Only one.
It's a good exercise.
That's cool, man.
It's a different way to think about design than we've been doing so far. So
Yeah, there's a lot of focus on like branding. Even UX is fairly new to this program. So there's, yeah, branding and typography, and it's like a fairly print heavy program. Yeah, so thinking about digital design is like kind of fairly new for a lot of students.
I
Yeah,
actually
I
think
love torturing them.
I actually think that is a way that if you picture it as being real things, like you're actually making physical products, it makes a lot more sense. So like if instead of seeing a digital button on a screen and having to imagine its states and stuff like that, the more you think of things as being tangible and they do something, you can almost touch them. It starts to make it a bit more real, and so it's not so abstract. So if you're talking about a form on a website, like if people had a physical form right in front of them and then they could press a button and it went somewhere. There's different ways of finding a model to make it make sense to you, which isn't about what's on the screen.
My favorite topic right now is skeuomorphism, and how I believe that, you know, there's I don't know, maybe multiple, it's like a gray scale of schools of thought, right? I kind of believe that everything is skeuomorphic, like buttons are buttons because there used to be buttons in real life and now they're digital buttons. They've abstracted their way into digital language, but they started as skeuomorphic. And I feel like with AI, with all this AI stuff happening, that skeuomorphism is going to make a bit of a comeback, because we're going to have to understand how to interact with things on a different scale. Once those glasses, Apple's got glasses coming out, probably by the end of the year, maybe, or 2000, or what are we, 23, 24? Anyway, the goggles are coming out in June, soon followed by glasses, then contacts. So
But look at like electric cars with a lot of the dashboards, they're huge touchscreens. And what they found was this looks really fancy, you know, if it's got no dashboard but a touchscreen, you're like, oh, that looks cool. But you try using it while you're driving, it's a nightmare because you're used to the tactile, the more tangible things, and all of a sudden you're like glancing over while you're driving and trying to slide your finger on a piece of plastic. You're like, it's
yeah,
not the same thing.
yeah, that's so true. I wonder, yeah.
I fear that people are going to be even more distracted. You know what I mean? If you've got
Yeah.
glasses on and it's like all this stuff happening in your glasses, I'm just waiting for the.
I bet if you're moving like more than 10 miles an hour, they'll probably say, we've shut this off so you don't crash.
You know, I'm looking forward to autonomous cars, so then you can sit there and enjoy it.
Yeah, that's
It's like,
true.
oh,
That's
drive
true.
itself, and I'll just sit back and watch some augmented reality or something.
Yeah, watch kittens. Some
Yep,
kittens
there you
on
go.
Instagram. All right, cool. I will let you go. Thank you so much again for visiting. And
No
yeah,
worries.
and I'll speak to you soon.
Nice. Well, nice to meet you all.
thank you.
Bye.
Later.